If you haven't already done it, make sure you click on submit in the daily participation or resubmit. Text box will open up and type the 3 most significant points. So there's microeconomics and macroeconomics. And obviously, because of the prefixes, and this is why we learn about prefixes and suffixes in that in English class, but micro means smaller, macro means bigger. And so microeconomics studies individual income and outcome. So what people are doing on an individual basis. It also analyzes different types of businesses and how we categorize them. And probably one of the most important things is it analyzes supply and demand on an individual basis. So individual items in the economy. What is the supply and demand of cotton, mandarin oranges, shoelaces, boats? And one other thing a lot of people don't think about is the supply and demand of labor. That's how we determine wages. Supply and demand of labor. So how many people are willing to work is the supply, and how many businesses are willing to hire is the demand. And that helps determine the prices. That's why, for instance, professional athletes, even though they don't do something that's important, they get paid a lot of money because there's very few people that have that talent, so the supply is low. And lots of people like to relax by watching sports. There's a high demand for it. So therefore, they get higher wages than people that perform brain surgery or teach or defend this country. That's why they make enormous amounts of money. And it's not just this country, of course, that occurs in other places in the world. In other places in the world, soccer players make lots of money. So that happens everywhere. And that's the same way with all forms of entertainment because of mass production and TV and movies and all that. Of course, they can have a much bigger audience of demand, and there's very few people that have that level of talent in all the entertainment field. So they make lots of money for that. So microeconomics studies those kinds of things, including the supply and demand of labor and how prices are created. And macroeconomics studies the bigger picture. So it looks at the overall wealth or income of a nation. And the most popular statistic we use for that is the gross domestic product, or GDP. And of course, the United States, China have two of the highest GDPs in the world, over $20 trillion, even though we have 1 billion less people. And we also look at things like employment, the labor force, which only includes people that are working or people that have looked for a job within the last 30 days. That's all that it includes. So once you give up, you're not included in those numbers anymore. And of course, the percentage of people looking for work is the unemployment rate. So the unemployment is something that macroeconomists research and study. And it also deals with what we call aggregate decisions. Aggregate means total. So decisions that are going to impact the total economy. And whenever people in government or business groups look at things like that, they look at aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And those things are total supply. So the supply of everything, the demand for everything. They also look at price levels. And what word do we associate with price levels? Inflation. That is the value or rising prices that occur inside the economy. So that's another macroeconomic statistic that these types of economists look at quite a bit. Inflation and unemployment are often in reverse of each other. So if one is low, the other is high. Because if lots of people are working, unemployment is low, they're purchasing lots of products, they're driving prices up. And so inflation is higher. And the opposite is true. Once inflation gets so high, it makes things too expensive. People get pessimistic. They stop hiring people, then they lay off people. And so then you look at unemployment going up. And then as unemployment goes up, then inflation goes down. And so they're like in a seesaw pattern. The only thing that can change that, of course, is government policy. It is possible for some type of mistakes to be made so that both end up being high at the same time. For instance, the governments of oil-producing countries formed OPEC in the 70s, which drove up prices at the same time that many countries were also going through a recession. So it's possible for both to happen at the same time, but it's incredibly unusual. And the last thing I want to mention with macroeconomics is they study the business cycle. The business cycle follows a wave pattern that we see in natural sciences, and it involves the growth of the economy that happens during an expansionary period. The peak of that wave is concluded as the high point, especially in our gross domestic product at that time. And then when that wave, you start to go on the downside of it, we call that a contraction, where the economy starts to shrink, people are laid off, less is produced. And whenever we reach the bottom point of that, it's called a trough, the same that is in when we study waves in natural sciences. So right now, for instance, it looks like we're going back to an expansionary period, although that's kind of shaky. It depends if people's pessimism kicks in, which is possible. We'll definitely be able to tell because of the holiday season if consumer spending returns back to normal. So that is the kinds of things that macroeconomists study as opposed to microeconomics.